And we're back to talk on the shit show of French politics about the new left coalition, the NUPS.
Yes. So, getting back to this coalition, so it's regrouping four of the main left-wing party. So, La France Insoumise, the Socialist Party, Europe Écologie Les Verts, which is the Green Party, and the Communist Party. And so, starting with the leader of the coalition, which was logic considering that they had close to 22% to the last presidential election, La France Insoumise, conducted by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, it's...
In votes in the last presidential elections, do you remember how it is, or shall I look for it?
You can look for it. So, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, it's a very, very, very divisive political figure. I think you can say that he's really a major political figure on the left, but there's also a really love him or hate him gut reaction when you talk about him. Also, the first thing that I could mention is that he has a bunch of very, very, very annoying fans on the internet. So if you think about the worst of what the Bernie Bros had to offer, it's basically the same, and it's really annoying. Stop! Don't arrest people online.
Which is sorry. Let's stop here for a minute, no? Because for what I've understood of the Bernie Bros, there's been pretty much a harassment dynamics and absolute aggressive verbal doxing and really getting into if you didn't agree with the guy, they will go after you like a pack of wolves, and similar to what we've seen as well on the Trump campaign and whatnot, right? So we can see a very, very similar kind of collective mob mentality dynamic, both in the left and the populist right.
Yes, exactly, because part of this leaning is to have a populist left, and I would say it's probably less intense because it's not the same numbers, obviously. But yeah, it's been the same thing in that any criticism against Mélenchon and against the party La France Insoumise can be met with waves of harassment, and it's really a disgrace, obviously. But I wanted to start with that. And there are problems also with Jean-Luc Mélenchon himself, which I'm going to get to, but part of his supporter base has been really shitty online, and yeah, that should be underlined. But before getting to what's problematic with the Jean-Luc Mélenchon, I'm going to be fully transparent here. You also have to admire the guy because he clearly understood what the problem would be with the... So he used to be in the Socialist Party for a very long time. He was even part of a socialist government as associate minister for professional education. But then after 2005 and the vote for the European Constitution, to which he supported the no, because he was very critic of the liberal direction that the European Union was building. He left the Socialist Party because he was already criticizing the liberal leaning of the Socialist Party. He also very early
What time are we? Which year are we talking about? Approximately?
Yeah, so the vote for the European Constitution was 205. He left the Socialist Party in 208. He created the Leftist Party. So his inspiration at the time was the German Party Die Linke. So he looks a lot to other countries and philosophers for inspiration. And what's interesting with him is that he's had a blog since 2004, and he's written a lot. So he's very transparent about his ideology, his evolution, and his political strategy, which is not that common in politics. So in 2008 he had the Left Party, and then he was candidate to the presidential election for the first time. He did 11%. Which was huge at the time, because if you were not socialist, making more than 10%, it was really unseen. So he, even at that time, he was campaigning well. Then in 2016, he created La France Insoumise. He was a presidential candidate in 2017, and he did a very surprising 19%, so making him equal with the main parties of the election. And in 2022, he made close to 22%, coming in third and very close behind Marine Le Pen. So confirming that La France Insoumise was the leading force on the left. And this was not a given, because he's been having very good scores in the presidential election, because he's a very good public speaker and a very good campaigner. But then in the parliamentary election and local election, they had very bad results. They didn't consolidate it. In the intermediate election, the Green Party and the Socialists maintained good results. So that was a bit one of the issues going into the presidential election. It's like, which party on the left would come up as the leading force, and the ecologists and the socialists were really hoping that they would get people on the left who were disappointed by Macron, and that they would rebuild a center-left liberal party. And this did not happen, since, as we know, they all did extremely poor score, and the left electorate who voted Macron didn't leave him, just got cemented to the right.
So we're talking about 7,200,000 votes versus 8 million for Marine Le Pen. So that's the scale, no? And we're talking about 9 million something for Macron.
Yeah,
9,700,000, 8,100,000. 7,200,000. So there's still a difference of 2,500,000 with Macron, and there's a difference of a difference that we should not ignore, of 1 million with Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, right? Total was closer to 500,000. So at this scale, it was not much. But what's important to note is that in terms of global, it still makes it more or less three blocks. That was the main lesson from the presidential election, that you had one left bloc around the leftist model promoted by La France Insoumise, one far right bloc around Marine Le Pen, and one liberal bloc on Macron. And this evolution was there before, but it was sort of cemented by the presidential election, and that's the status of the force. And this is what drove the coalition on the left, because before that, the left parties were all trying to exist in their own sphere. And after this election, it's okay, the only way we can move forward is to have a coalition. And again it's huge. I'll get back on the history of leftist coalition, but they don't happen that often. And what's also notable here is that in France we still have, I mean, a lot of countries go through that, but we have a huge abstention, because a lot of people don't go to vote because sometimes because they don't have the means to, but most of the time because they think that political parties are not the same, the election is not going to change their life, and the situation cannot improve. And in the people who don't vote, a huge amount of them is popular classes and the younger population. So right now we still have these dynamics where the three blocks are are more or less in a pocket. But then if there is a dynamic that is created and that gets back and that brings back to the vote the people who didn't vote anymore, then it could completely change. Because when we talk in terms of numbers, percentage or full numbers, it doesn't take into consideration all the people who don't vote, and the change of political forces and dynamics will really reside in the upcoming years.
Well, specifically in the second round of the Macron Marine Le Pen presidential, it is a 28% abstention. No, so 72 of each 100 voters went to vote, which is not necessarily a bleak picture. Let's say abstention is of course it should be higher, but
for presidential election it's very low. In the 50s 60s you had 80-85% participation, and when you get to the parliamentary election and local election it gets even more dire. Last year was the first time that there were more people not voting than voting, so abstention was above 50% in local elections. So no, it's a real phenomenon, and it has increased in recent years, and part of the strategy on the left is to try to get people who don't go to vote, because obviously part of these voters might go to Macron or Le Pen, since we're talking about voters from the popular classes, but the most disenfranchised from the votes are popular classes and the young, who tend to vote left more, but with the incapacity of the socialists when they were in power, and they had 2 presidencies and several decades in power, but they didn't do any or very little politically that would change people's the general population living conditions for the better. So then it has turned people away from the vote, because they all do the same politics and it's not going to change anything for them. So why should they bother? Something else interesting with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, getting back to the history of La France Insoumise, it's also that he's been both very consistent on what he wants, so to have a politic that would be more socially oriented, so the traditionally socialist. But he's also managed to evolve, because his political origin was to be a classic Marxist, strongly anti-Stalinist. That's important, especially in the wake of the Bolshevism accusation. He was very opposed to Stalinism, especially in the wake of the invasion of Prague in 1968. But he was a classic productivist Marxist. He was also very strongly...
what does it mean?
Meaning the notion of prosperity through economic growth and an increase of production. But he's been clearly over the years incorporating different orientation from feminist movement, from ecological movement, from anti-racist groups. So it's interesting to see that his position has shifted on some aspects, and since the end of the 2000s, so since more than 10 years, he's been labeling himself as eco-socialist. So with this idea that you cannot have ecological planification without a change of productive logic and more sustainable, renewable production. And defending ecological planification to combat the upcoming climate crisis. So there has been in his policy and the way he's adjusted his program and strategy some very interesting things in that it's clear that he's also very aware of societal change and able to incorporate them. However, there are also very strong critics against him. So some are right-wing moral panics, but some are justified. And if I want to be honest in the portrait, I will have to touch at least on the most important one. First one that is being called out for being...
he eats children.
And the left eats children, obviously. But the fact that he's very autocratic, which is true, La France Insoumise doesn't have a democratic structure. I mean, they have discussion space. They have a popular parliament where they elaborate propositions for the program and so on. But the ultimate final decision rests
relies on him.
yeah, rest with Grandpa Jean-Luc, and it's, well, as any centralized. I would say it was very strong at first. It's less strong now because since 2017 he's really been pushing a younger generation of leftist activists, some of whom are also emerging as very strong and very committed political leaders. But it's true that for most of the time he really had the strong hand on the party direction, and with a bit of you're with me or against me attitude. So on the one hand, it allowed him to really have a cohesive politics and to keep a strong dynamics. But the issue was because he's 70 right now, so what happens when he retires? But the fact that now he's been really building up his succession with not one figure but a whole group of young 30-ish activists and politicians, I would say is a good sign.
What else?
Yeah,
Give me
but there was this notion of having leftist populism to combat the right-wing populism of Le Front National. That was a bit iffy at times, but I feel like they've moved away from this. The second big aspect is international policy, and here I would agree. Some takes were really bad. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is notoriously anti-Atlantist and not anti-United States, but opposed to the big influence of
Atlantis, you mean OTAN? NATO?
Yeah, NATO, and generally speaking, alliance with the United States. In that, he has a very old-fashioned Cold War mentality, in that we should not be subjected to American interest, and so on and so forth. And some of it makes it, his analysis in terms of international politics sometimes are completely off rail, because there's always this notion of the problem is the United States. And there are problems with the United States foreign policy, but here it goes so far that it becomes obsessive and gives very poor results. Especially, so like I said, he was a very strong anti-Stalinist, so he wasn't leaning toward the USSR. However, he had a lot of sympathy for the sister socialist republic, so which made him sympathetic sometimes to dictatorial structure, especially, for example, to Cuba when they were under American embargo. Never mind that it was the Castro dictatorship, that kind of things. And also, for a very long time, he had the idea that we needed to work with the Russian partnership to compensate for American involvement and stronghold in international policy, and this made him also very lenient with Putin, and saying that and trying to turn a blind eye to Putinist authoritarianism, thinking that no, but we need to have Russia as a partner. It's very important, and of course he's changed since the invasion of Ukraine, and he's very strongly condemned the aggression against Ukraine. But I would say at this stage it's a bit too little, too late, and he's been for so long saying that. I would say not out of love of Vladimir Putin, because on the far right you had Marine and other countries. So Marine has been
anti-imperialist sentiment of the empire has the stronger foot and has the hardest grip. So we need to. That's one of the first priorities.
Yeah,
not to
exactly.
to get away from the imperial pressures.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a bit of the same with China. So at least in China, he acknowledges that it's an authoritarian regime, but it's like, but China has this such wonderful culture and history, and he also had this whole take of not butting heads with China too much, even on the subjects of human rights, because again, we need China as a partner to balance the international diplomacy forces. And yeah, so this is a huge problem, and it's usually one of the first things that come up with people saying that they could not vote for him or his policy. It's but the international policy, and I agree. But again, one of the good things with Jean-Luc Mélenchon is that he's capable of change and acknowledging when he has changed position. Even though on the whole Russia thing, they've been sort of brushing it under the rug in that sense, but I don't think it's something that's going to be strong. And then the second aspect, which I really want to touch on, but I'm not concerned and not a specialist, but it's the issue of anti-Semitism on the left, and it's not a new issue, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon has had, again, some very gauche takes. I think one of the strongest one recently. I'm paraphrasing here, but he was talking about the neo-fascist candidate Éric Zemmour, but who happens to be of Jewish descent. I guess we'll talk about him more at another point. But he was saying that Mr. Zemmour, he's really leaning into this Jewish tradition of conservatism where any change is good, and this was criticized a lot, and he's even backed down and afterwards recognized that it was a bad take, because saying that because you're Jewish you're necessarily conservatist and reluctant to change is an anti-Semitic trope, and there has been also other images that were problematic with the idea that bankers and financiers are your enemies, and also relying on a bit of anti-Semitic trope of the Jewish controlling the finance. And the thing is, something very important is that the program, especially the current program of the leftist coalition, is not anti-Semitic, and anti-Semitic is not part of the rhetoric, but I feel like that there is an anti-Semitic legacy on the left. Founders of leftist thought, like Proudhon, like Marx, had very bad comments on the Jews because they were sort of inheriting this anti-Semitic trope of Jewish bankers having this immense amount of power, and so I would say it's part of the cultural baggage. It hasn't been acknowledged on the left, and there is a work to be done with that, and rightly so for a lot of people. These anti-Semitic tropes and takes sometimes popping up below the surface is a huge turnoff, which should absolutely be. But again, when you look at the program, it doesn't integrate discrimination like a far-right program would do, but they have this sort of cultural background that they have not completely deconstructed, and that's a real problem.
Great. So we'll continue in another segment, and we'll hear more about the other parts of the coalition, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you.